All right, so this lecture set is going to be on ecology. Ecology is really, really important in terms of how we manage the range. Rangeland is, we look at rangeland as a natural ecosystem. And if that's the case, then it's really important for us to understand the science of ecology, or at least some of the basics of ecology before we understand how we make changes and how we think about changes to an ecosystem. So, ecology, the interrelationships. Sorry about that. That's what we want to think about, right? The study of interrelationships. Let's do this in red to really emphasize it. Blue would be better. There we go. The study of interrelationships. So, there's not only interrelationships between living things that we are aware of, but also living and non-living entities in the ecosystem. And it's important to realize that those relationships are occurring. Now, we want something a little bit different than the pure science of ecology. In range management, we actually want products and services off of the ecosystem. So that makes us a little bit different than pure ecology, so we like to say that range management is applied ecology, ecology that is viewed almost as a tool in order to perform a service or give us goods off of the rangeland. So one of the things we start with is that plants and animals depend on each other for their welfare. So that's one of the basic ecological relationships, is that plants are able to capture energy, animals are able to transfer that energy to themselves, and that is key, and that's foundational to the job of managing range for all kinds of different services, not goods and services, not just for me, but as we'll discover later, for also for other services. So range managers usually think about really the manipulation. We'll discuss what that means here in a bit. Manipulating the vegetation and soil by means of animals that will consume that material. So here's a typical system that you might find on the range here in the West, and you can see that the distinction here is between abiotic on the left-hand side and biotic parts of the ecosystem. So on the abiotic parts, the parts that are non-living, we have sunlight energy, we have rainfall, nutrients in the system, heat energy that gets released in the system. None of these things are living, right? On the right-hand side, we got the biotic components, so we have grasses that are interacting with the sunlight energy. We have the antelope, and we have some decomposers and other microorganisms that we know are there. So that's the essential beginning division, is this division between what is living and what is non-living. Now, you're not going to draw a line down that in the ecosystem, but you need to get these things straight in your mind, because the discussion and the understanding of ecosystems relies on you understanding that there is this kind of division. It's divisible, but they are interrelated. So that if something gets changed in an ecosystem, so since these pieces, these abiotic and biotic pieces are linked in some way, distinguishable, right, but linked in lots of different ways. If one of those items changes, one of those characteristics changes, it's going to change. It has the potential to change other characteristics of the ecosystem. So if I increase the temperature, which is an abiotic component of an ecosystem, I'm also going to increase biological activity, all things being equal, right? If everything was equal and we had, let's say, 15 inches of rainfall a year, 20 inches of rainfall a year in the ecosystem, and I increase the temperature in that ecosystem, all other things being equal, I will typically increase the biologic activity up to a certain point in that ecosystem. So they're related. So these abiotic and biotic components are related to one another, even though they're distinguishable from one another. And so that's why we spend time talking about climate, talking about soils, and then switching over and talking about plants and how they're growing and or regrowing. Right? You want to have the whole picture of what's happening out there. To be a good manager, you need that whole picture. So we have some definitions here, and these are more on the plant side in terms of definition. So we have herbage, and that's what we're thinking about, all the biomass of the herbaceous vegetation at one point in time standing out in a given range. Okay, so all the biomass. That includes edible parts and non-edible parts, right? But the edible parts, we have another word for, and we call that forage, right? So the forage is that herbage which is acceptable to grazing animals, is grazable and usable by grazing animals. We also have some other parts of plants and different kinds of plants we call browse, right? Browse. Sometimes leaf, sometimes twig growth, but mostly on these other kinds of they're shrubs and woody plants. Sometimes they're referred to as a little less herbaceous, right? A little less green than you would think of as a grass plant as being. So that browse is that sort of looking at that other material that is also consumable to animals. So those are some things you can think about. We have a host of other things to understand about the biotic component in an ecosystem for range managers. These concepts are really key because they give us that indicator of how productive our range system might be in terms of what we want to gain from that range system, right? These might not be very important to just a regular ecologist who's going out to look at this ecosystem, but for us as studying range management, we have a particular set of items that we would like to see off of range, right? We don't just want to observe what's happening out there. We actually want to observe and get a product off of that range. Another aspect. So we had livestock and insects and things like that are on the range that are important. But we have other things happening, and these players, these decomposers, microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, all these sorts of things play a pretty significant role in all ecosystems. We don't understand them incredibly well, but we know that they are important, and so they're a piece of that ecosystem, and we want to make sure that we understand them. So we have these microorganisms. We have other larger versions of those microorganisms. Nematodes are one they're kind of fun. So I've got a couple of pictures of those that aren't often thought about, but are players in the ecosystem. And it's just a single example of how there are players that we need to be aware of, right? There are components and aspects of ecosystems that we need to be aware of when we're managing these really, really complex ecosystems for a purpose in range management. So this is a nematode. It's a small worm. Think about it like a mini earthworm. And this nematode can crawl around in the soil, in the soil pore spaces. They actually do consume. So we're just a little bit. They actually do consume other organisms, protozoa, things like that. With this little stylet, this thing is think of it like a spear right there, and it can eject that stylet and do some real damage to other organisms as well as plants. Here's another one, right? This is a scanning electron microscope image of it. And here it looks a lot closer to what we know an earthworm looks like, but they're microscopic, right? And they are players. They're players in all ecosystems, and they're players in range ecosystems. Kind of fun. Whenever we talk about players in ecosystems, right, biotic components of the ecosystem, one thing that may be more often than not left out is actually humans, right? We are, and in our particular case for range management, we care pretty deeply about what happens on this rangeland, and so we're going to manipulate it, right? This prefix here is from the Latin for hand. Okay, so we're going to have a hand in what happens in this ecosystem. It doesn't mean we're evil, doesn't mean we're bad. We are as much an ecosystem component, a biotic component of the ecosystem as a nematode, as an insect, as a antelope. We are in that ecosystem, and we have a say in what happens in that ecosystem. So we are manipulators, and we are critical in the case of range to what happens on that ecosystem, right? But we've been saying here, like, hey, we actually want a product off of this ecosystem, products or services off of this ecosystem, and we're willing to rearrange and control things on this ecosystem in order to get those products. Now, sometimes do humans overstep their bounds? Maybe so. Probably so. I've seen instances in around Chicago where maybe we've overstepped our bounds and contaminated the natural world for a long, long time to come, and that's certainly true. But just because we contaminate doesn't mean necessarily that we need to get off and get out and get away from these natural ecosystems, right? We're as much as of a component as the animals and the microbes. So we have this connection, and you need to understand that these organisms are connected. We don't have a whole lot of time to think through the many layers of connection that are in an ecosystem, right? So we're just introducing this. Hopefully later on down the line you'll be able to take an ecology class. We have an ecology class here at Northwest College that you can take to think even more deeply about that. But we want to at least broach the subject and think about how it's important, right? So the thing here is that we have effect, we have cause and effect in an ecosystem, right? We have action and reaction in an ecosystem that makes up that particular kind of ecology. One of the pieces that we want to just make sure we have discussed in this class is multiple use. So you see this bear here, and you could easily argue that this grizzly is a biotic component of range ecosystems. So they must be dealt with, right? They have to be considered when you are managing that ecosystem. The wildlife has to be considered when you manage the ecosystem, even if you're managing it exclusively for livestock. So we have wildlife, we've got lumber, we've got minerals, water, recreation, all these things, as we talked about in the beginning of this class, all these things have to be considered, have to be weighed out when we're making decisions about rangeland. Now, that goes for federal lands as well as private lands. So that you have to understand that what you do on your own private land has an effect on the broader ecosystem, so that needs to be kept in mind. All right, so let's think about ecosystem function a little bit. Now, the two pieces, let's call them abiotic, even though we're going to get into the biotic. Abiotic aspects of an ecosystem are energy and chemicals, or nutrients. You can think about them either way. Energy and nutrients. These are really the gas in the tank of an ecosystem. The ability to capture nutrients, and the only way we can capture, the most significant way that we capture energy in an ecosystem is through the activity of plants being able to do photosynthesis and have solar gain, and turn that solar gain into, with the help of water and carbon dioxide and, of course, nutrients that build the plant, their ability to capture that and turn it into a product that is useful by animals, right? And so one way you may not have thought about this, but you think about, okay, this we'll turn red here. This thing is hot, right? And it sends energy to the plant. The plant says, cool, I'll capture that, and I'm going to store, you can think about it as heat, right? That's an energy source. I'm going to store this energy in this thing called glucose, right? A really simple sugar. And it can use that for all different kinds of products. The bison that we have here consumes that energy-containing material, and the bison, should you put your hand on the bison, you'll learn really fast that it is not cold. It is, in fact, hot. And that heat that is emanating, right, from that bison is basically sun energy captured in a plant and given to the bison so that it can maintain a steady body temperature and move around, and so you've got heat coming off. That's cool, right? Because we went through this process of capturing solar energy and actually re-releasing it as heat. So when you think about energy, that's one thing you can think about. Not only that, but when this bison consumed this plant material here, this plant material contained nutrients that were from the ground, okay, from the soil, and those nutrients were building blocks and building leaves and all the structures that a plant needs to grow: roots, crown, buds, you name it. And when the bison consumes that, not only does it get that energy source, but also gets a nutrient source, right? So that goes into building amino acids and in animal and protein and so forth, and complex cellular structures and organs and lots of other cool stuff, teeth and horns and eyeballs and all kinds of stuff, right? So nutrients are required to be able to do that. So we're back to our, hey, number one, energy flow, and number two, chemical or nutrient cycles are important. Now, when the carnivore consumes this grass eater, right, the herbivore, it transfers some of that energy and it transfers some of those nutrients into its body, right? And when that thing dies, whatever carnivore dies and is decomposed in the soil, those nutrients go back to the ground and can be taken back up again through the soil in the plant. Not only that, but we always have this energy, right? Right here, this energy being lost from one stage to another, and so you've got this respiration and heat that loses, quote unquote, energy, and not only that, the decomposers that are down here are also releasing that material. Cool. Okay, so that was a pretty simplistic version of it. Here is a much bigger version of it, and here we're going to draw this little line right down here and say, okay, over here we've got we have beings, biology that produces, right? They capture sunlight and produce. Over here we've got consumers. They don't produce any energy in and of themselves. They have to consume energy from somewhere else. And we have primary and secondary and tertiary biology. Class will teach you this. Ecology class will teach you it even better, right? But this whole thing, you have to understand the mechanics of this whole thing in order to really understand what's happening in range management. Now, what this graph shows is, so here's your primary consumers, right? We're on the consumers here and not the producers, right? As you move from one stage of consumer to another stage of consumer, you're actually losing, quote unquote, some of that energy to heat, right? To just straight up trying to keep yourself warm, right? So part of what you ate for lunch today will be used to keep yourself warm, and that energy will radiate out from you and heat up your desk and heat up the walls and heat up the bed or wherever you are. Okay, so that there's a portion of this energy that gets lost as we move from one what we call trophic level to another trophic level. So that seems a little bit like bad news, but it's not all bad news because you have this incredible supply of energy from the sun that keeps getting captured and keeps getting captured by these plants, miraculous things. Okay, for chemical cycles we have a little bit more of a recycling, right, of a reusing of those chemicals in a system, right? Particularly in perennial plant systems, we have a nice, efficient way of reusing those chemicals and those nutrients, what we call plant nutrients. So the soil acts as a big bucket to keep those nutrients for the most part. Some of them, of course, can be lost, and that's normal. Lost to grazing, lost to erosion, lost to water moving through the soil. So there is some losses. It's not 100% efficient, but they are recyclable, and so that's an important component, important thing to understand about chemical cycles. So what does it all look like in terms of the nutrients, right? So you can see nutrients in all of these boxes, right? So we could start here with soil nutrients, right? We can have soil nutrients be taken up by vegetation, right? By plants, right here. Plants can die themselves. The nutrients can go through the decomposers, the microbes, and back into the soil nutrients. So that's an easy one, right? We also have these nutrients that are in the plants. They can be taken up by herbivores, which pushes them into a bunch of different, right? This here would be just a giant food web, right? Here, so the herbivores can expel that onto the soil, and it goes back into soil nutrients. Herbivores can they themselves die? Okay, they can expel other things. They can be consumed by carnivores, who then expel things and or expel over here, or die, of course, and things go back. Right. This is the cycle of nutrients in any ecosystem. Right. This is us here. This is eating animals that have consumed plant material off of the range. And so there is some loss, right? This isn't 100% efficient. There is some loss in the system. Decomposers are not 100% efficient. Recapture of these nutrients in the urine or the feces is not 100% efficient as well. But there is a cycle to it, right? There is a reusability to it. Interestingly enough, and I like to talk about these because they're pretty cool. Interesting enough, there's a relationship between plants and a bacteria, rhizobia bacteria, that allow them to actually to bring in nutrients from what's up here, right? So this is air, and air is 78% nitrogen or so, and these little nodules here can actually basically think about it like breathing in nitrogen gas and making it in a form that's usable by the plant, right? This is really incredible because we have this supply, we have a big supply in the air of nitrogen, but it's not usable in its natural state by plants and therefore by animals. But in this relationship with this bacteria, the legumes in particular, legumes can fix that nitrogen and bring it back into the ecosystem. Okay, so we said that we want to get things off of a rangeland. And here's where we get to the point where we say, okay, well, like what things, right? So we can start way over here on the goods side. There's the foods, fiber, fuels, maybe. So pharmaceuticals, yeah, for sure. Building materials, yeah, before harvesting wood. Industrial products that were derived from natural products and so forth, right? So these are the things that we typically think about with like, hey, what's in it for humanity, right? In terms of what we're managing in range. What is often forgot are these ecosystem services, right? Things that happen in a range ecosystem that are actually really important to us that we don't often think about, like purification of air and water, right? We want our water to be clean, and if our rangelands aren't vibrant and healthy ecosystems, our water will not be clean and our air will not be clean, right? You have a bunch of dust particulates in the air, and that's not good for you to breathe in. Recreation, right? We mentioned that in the beginning of this class and said that's something that's of value, right? How much value? Well, it depends, but we know it's of value. So we have all these services that are important in their ecosystem, what we call ecosystem services, that the health of the ecosystem determines if these services are actually happening on our ecosystem, or for better or for worse. Over here on these processes, these are just things that are naturally happening in an ecosystem, okay, that sometimes are good, sometimes are not so great, right? So like soil erosion, that's not so great, but it is a natural process. Evapotranspiration, it helps out with our hydrological cycle, right? Infiltration, all these things. So these are things that are always occurring on our range ecosystems. They may or may not help us with how well we're doing in these other areas as well. So you have an ecosystem. An ecosystem doesn't stay what we call static, right? It doesn't stay the same all the time. Again, you have something like global warming, the temperature starts to rise. Some species thrive in that, some species don't. Maybe the temperature rises and causes a drought, and some species thrive and some species don't. And then you have a cooling off, 200 years later, you've got a cooling off event, and some species thrive and some species don't. So we call that we call that change succession, right? Succession. So if somebody succeeds to the throne, that is a change of who's sitting on the throne, right? Who's succeeding this person in as being the CEO of a company or a king of a country and so forth. So ecosystems don't change. So we have some words and theories that we use to understand how they do change, and that is what we call succession and climax community. Okay, so plant succession involves the replacement of one plant community by another until the final community is reached. Right, and it's a bit of a nebulous, a bit of a weird thing because we just said that they don't stay the same. Over time. So we understand that they do change eventually, but we should be able to say at some given point in time that it has reached a stable form of that community, given what we know about the history of that community. Once it's reached that stable form, we call it the climax community, and this is the golden standard that we weigh. In rangelands. We weigh what we observe to what we believe based on historical evidence that the community should be able to support. Okay, so we have two kinds of succession. The first is primary, obviously, and the second is, secondary. So primary succession is when we go from virtually bare ecosystem, right, or very young ecosystem, into a stable community, a stable plant community, primary succession. Okay, so from bare ground, maybe even open water, and we go all the way through the successional stages to get to stability, right? Plant stability, community stability, and we have all kinds of alterations that happen as you go through this, right? So total biomass, you should expect that the total biomass in that system to increase as you get closer to that point where you're being stable. Energy storage, diversity, rate of mineral cycling, these are all things that are increasing, okay, as we move down that line towards the stability that we're thinking about and maybe even wanting in primary succession. So we develop soil, we increase longevity, that is, of plant species as we increase in succession, as we move down the timeline of succession. We have started out with plants that can live in just a huge range of conditions, to plants that live in a smaller range, a much more narrow range of conditions and precipitation and these sorts of things. Greater accumulation of living tissue and litter per unit area with successional advance. That means more things are living and more things are dying. So we get more organic matter. If that's the case, then we're going to have more nutrients that are cycling in that system. When you change species, when you go from bare ground to living plant material, that gives you a different microclimate, a small niche climate in a particular kind of place, and that is different based on what we have growing there and how much of it we have growing there. We change in the size of a plant, right? You start off with these lichen and algae and molds and stuff like that, and you move to larger plants, larger perennial grasses, for instance. Increase the number of pathways for energy to flow. So energy is flowing there, and we have more microbial diversity, we have more plant diversity, we have more animal diversity, so we have a more complex food web kind of system. We mentioned that we've got more nutrients as well, and then we have greater resistance, so buffering capacity to fluctuation in those in the factors like rainfall, temperature, sunlight, wind, those sorts of things. So so we have a more resilient system. So here's our primary succession, going from the basic stages at the bottom to the climax stage at the top, of the stable stage at the top. And you can see on the right hand side you've got, okay, what happens in the soil, what does it go from, and what does it go to, and then we have on the left hand side, what do the plants go from, lichens, algae, mosses, and what do they go to. dense stand of tall, deep-rooted bunch and sod grasses, not many forbs and other vegetation. Now, this is a generalized statement. We might have some systems that their climax stage, their top stage right up here, does contain forbs, and maybe it contains shallow-rooted perennials or so forth. So again, this is just a generalization. So that's primary succession. Once we've reached the climax stage in primary succession, we can go through another set of succession developments, right? So secondary succession is some type of disturbance comes through the system. So here we have a picture of fire coming through the system, or overgrazing, or something like that. The mudslides that comes through that. So mudslides actually wouldn't be a great example, but fire would be the sort of the optimum examples. And when those come through, there's a definite change to the ecosystem, right? You take away some of that organic matter, you take away some of those nutrients, you change the color sometimes of the top of the soil, goes from maybe tan to maybe very dark black because of the charring that happens there. So you change some of those pieces of the ecosystem. When that happens, really what we want to pay attention to in range is what happens with vegetation, right? That gives us a clue as to how ranges respond to these kinds of events. Okay, typically secondary succession, that going from the disturbance after the disturbance has occurred back to a climax community is pretty fast compared to primary succession. And really what we want out of this is this predictability. We want to be able to say within X number of years, this is what we observe from that particular kind of range. So here's some secondary succession, maybe timelines, right? And it turns out in range that this is what we're all about. So these things are called state and transition models. Is what happens when we overgraze? What happens when fire is applied? What happens when we don't apply fire? Is that a good thing or a bad thing in this particular ecosystem? So you can look at this one on the left-hand side. In Utah, we've got a juniper woodland. We have fire applied. We have some sort of disturbance applied. We have this skeleton forest, bare soil. We have annuals come in, right? Annuals, those first colonizers, come in into this system. Then we move from that to perennial grass-forb shrubs, then perennial grass-forb and shrubs and young junipers. Then we have smaller junipers. Then we are back into that juniper stage. So we can trace this out, right? And if we know what the composition of this original juniper woodland is, and let's say that's the climax stage, if we know the composition of that, we know what kind of players are there in terms of the plant community, and we go out to somewhere where we know it should be juniper woodland, and what we find is a bunch of perennial grasses, perennial forbs, and shrubs. There, we know we can track where we are, right? That's cool, because now we have a map that says, oh, hey, you are here, okay, and you want to get back to here, okay, and here's how long this might take based on this roadmap that we have, right? You can look at these later in the notes, but the same thing happens over there. And not only do we have just this initial sort of fire that pushes it to a different place, we can have movement in succession, and we can have another smaller disturbance event that might push it to a different place on that roadmap. Okay, so the final stage of succession is this thing called the climax and climax community, and that's really what we want to look for in range, and that's so we look for this HCPC, historic climax plant community, as telling us what should the best, the pristine, the most productive of this version of rangeland, what should it look like? Now, before we say, hey, this is settled stuff, you do need to know that this is still we're still like learning this, right? It would take a long time to understand this if you set out to understand how range works or how an ecosystem works. Well, it might be 10 years, 20 years before you see a wildfire run across that land, and then it might be another 15 years before you really understand what happened from the fire to that 15-year period, right? So it takes a long time and lots of observations to understand how rangelands of various types, because we have all different types, rangelands of various types move through these successional stages to the climax community. We have some questions. Does it reach the climax community and stay there? Does it reach the climax community and shift back to some kind of other secondary community? Does it ever reach climax community? We'll bring up global warming again. I mean, so let's say we have this particular climax community that was based on a higher precipitation, and we haven't seen that precipitation in 30 years. Do we change? Do we need to change what the climax community actually should be, given the stage that we're at in terms of the climate? Maybe so. Okay. So we have some theories, right, about how we get to the climax community, right? So here, this one's pretty cool, because we have as time goes on from 0 to climax stage, we might ask, how does this rangeland get to that point? You can see this ribbon sort of thing moving from there, and it's cyclical, right, based on the yearly cycles and seasonal cycles and so forth, to get to this place where we can say, okay, we think it's fairly stable and productive, highly productive, based on the parameters of that particular rangeland, right? So this is one way to look at it. Here what you've got is, on the top, you have a simple version of successional tendencies, right? So let's say we've got this vegetation. We go out on the range and we measure vegetation. We measure the kind, the species of plants that are out there, and how much there is of species. And it's right at this point on the condition scale. It's not excellent, and it's not poor. Okay. Now we ask ourselves the question: okay, in this particular rangeland, if we left it alone, would it move this way, right? Would it move? So the successional tendency, we conclude, maybe, is that if you leave it alone, if you leave the rangeland alone, you don't graze it too much, the tendency is to move towards excellent or climax condition, right? If we put a lot of grazing pressure, the more grazing pressure we put on it, it moves towards poorer condition. Okay, so that's a simple way to think about it over time, right? Now, that's not all that happens on a rangeland, right? So here in the bottom one, we have, okay, well, maybe it is that way, but what if we have above average rainfall? What if we have 10 years of drought? What if we have 5 years of drought? What can we expect from this vegetation? We can't expect, if we have drought but we're not grazing, we can't necessarily expect it to move towards excellent conditions. So you start to factor in all these things into, and this is where just understanding ecosystem response to abiotic and biotic characteristics and changes really matters. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Just trying to get our head around what is an ecosystem. How do we think about what ecosystems are, abiotic and biotic? What about changes? How do ecosystems change over time? And then in range management, we really want to be able to map out those changes. That's the key component that we want to be able to have at the end of the day, so that we can walk out on a range and say, oh, we know this range should look like this. This is the climax condition expected in this area. Our range doesn't quite look like that. I wonder how we can make it, how we can move it to look more like the climax condition. The climax condition is going to be the most resilient, the most productive, and so forth.